They called him the Lion of Justice, a king who ruled both England and Normandy with iron precision. But behind Henry's crown lay a tangled web of heirs, bastards, and tragedies that shaped the next century of English history. From a daughter who would birth the Plantagenet dynasty to a son lost in a single shipwreck that doomed the royal line, Henry's children carried his ambition and his curse. Some became rulers, some rebels, some queens, and others vanished into legend. This is their story, the legitimate, the illegitimate, and the forgotten, each born of power, each caught in the storm of England's first great succession crisis. Welcome to the extraordinary tale of what happened to the children of Henry I of England. In the stone halls of Westminster and the Norman castles of Rouen, Henry thus presided over one of medieval Europe's most prolific royal bloodlines. Between his 2 wives and numerous mistresses, the Lion of Justice fathered over 20 children, a testament to both his virility and his political cunning. 2 children were born legitimate: Matilda, future empress and mother of kings, and William Adelin, the Golden Prince whose death would plunge England into chaos. But Henry's bastards were no mere accidents of royal appetite. Each served a purpose in the great chess game of medieval politics. Robert of Gloucester, his eldest bastard, would become the military genius who nearly restored his half-sister to the throne. Reginald de Dunstanville would hold Cornwall for decades, a loyal sword in the southwest. Henry's illegitimate daughters married into the nobility of Scotland, Brittany, and France, weaving Norman influence across the map of Europe. In an age where legitimacy was everything, Henry transformed bastardy into statecraft. He acknowledged his illegitimate children openly, granted them titles, arranged strategic marriages, and expected their loyalty in return. They were his instruments of alliance, his regional anchors, his insurance policy against the vicissitudes of war and politics. Yet for all his careful planning, for all the strategic marriages and cultivated alliances, Henry's grand design would collapse in a single November night in 1120. The White Ship disaster would claim not only his heir, but several of his bastards, leaving the carefully constructed web of Norman power suddenly, catastrophically fragile. This is the story of how those children, legitimate and bastard alike, lived, loved, fought, and died in service to their father's vision of empire. In February 1102, at the Palace of Sutton Courtenay, Queen Matilda of Scotland delivered Henry his first legitimate child. The infant was named Matilda after her mother, but fate would crown her with titles that dwarfed her birth name: Holy Roman Empress, Lady of the English, the woman who would be queen. From her earliest years, Matilda breathed the rarefied air of royal expectation. The Norman court trained her in statecraft alongside needlework, in languages alongside courtly graces. She could read Latin as fluently as Norman French, could discuss theology with abbots and strategy with generals. At 8 years old, she was already a diplomatic asset, too valuable to remain in England. In 1110, the child empress-elect sailed for Germany, betrothed to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V. She would not see English shores again for 2 decades. The marriage of Matilda to Henry V in 1114 was Norman diplomacy at its finest. Henry I had bound his daughter to the most powerful ruler in Christendom, creating an alliance that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Alps. For 7 years, Matilda ruled as empress, holding court in Speyer and Worms, mastering the intricate politics of the German nobility. She learned to command in a language that was not her birth tongue, to negotiate with princes who viewed her Norman blood with suspicion. When Henry V died childless in 1125, Matilda had proven herself capable of wielding imperial power. She had also learned something that would serve her well in the trials ahead: that a woman could rule if she possessed the will and wisdom to do so. I summoned his daughter home to a transformed England. She returned not as a young princess, but as a seasoned empress, widowed at 23, carrying herself with the authority of one who had commanded the loyalty of German dukes. In 1127, at the Christmas court in Windsor, Henry took a step that shocked the Norman nobility. He named Matilda his heir. The assembled barons swore fealty to her, but their oaths carried the bitter taste of reluctance. England had never been ruled by a queen in her own right. The very idea seemed to violate the natural order, yet Henry's will was law, and his barons bent the knee to his daughter. In 1128, Henry arranged his daughter's second marriage to Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou. Matilda was 26, Geoffrey barely 15, a political union that would birth a dynasty. The age gap was scandalous, the cultural divide deeper still. Matilda, imperial and Norman, found herself wed to an Angevin boy who wore a sprig of yellow broom flower in his cap, the Plantagenista that would give his descendants their name. The marriage was stormy from the start. Matilda and Geoffrey separated twice, their reconciliations driven more by political necessity than personal affection. Yet from this turbulent union came the future of England. Henry, born in 1133, who would become the first Plantagenet king. When Henry III died in 1135, the careful architecture of succession collapsed overnight. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the crown while Matilda was in Normandy. What followed was 19 years of civil war, the anarchy, as aunt and nephew fought for the throne of England. Matilda invaded England in 1139, landing at Arundel with a handful of supporters. Her campaign was a masterclass in medieval warfare and diplomacy. She captured Stephen at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, came within reach of coronation in Westminster Abbey, yet saw victory slip through her fingers when London rose against her. For 7 years she fought, winning battles and losing wars, proving herself in combat while remaining denied in ceremony. Her forces controlled the west and much of the north, yet she could never quite grasp the prize that should have been hers by right. In 1148, Matilda finally abandoned her claim and returned to Normandy. She had failed to become Queen of England, but she had succeeded in something perhaps more important. She had preserved the Plantagenet succession. Her son Henry would claim the throne in 1154, not as a usurper, but as the rightful heir of Henry I. Matilda lived until 1167, long enough to see her son establish the greatest empire medieval Europe had known. She died at Rouen, the city where her grandfather William the Conqueror had held court. Her tomb inscribed simply, "Great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring." In the end, the empress who never wore the crown of England had done something no king could. She had given birth to a dynasty that would rule for 3 centuries. In the summer of 1103, Queen Matilda of Scotland delivered Henry I, the son every king prayed for. William Adelin, his name a diminutive of his grandfather's, was born into a world that had waited 17 years for a Norman heir. The bells of Westminster Abbey rang for hours, and across England the succession was secure. From his first breath, William carried the weight of 2 kingdoms. He was heir to England, future Duke of Normandy, the bridge between the conquering Normans and the conquered English. In him, Henry I saw not just a son, but the preservation of everything William the Conqueror had built. Henry groomed his son with the methodical precision that marked everything he did. William learned statecraft in the royal chancery, warfare in the practice yards of his father's castles. He was tutored in law and theology, in the complex art of medieval kingship that balanced brute force with bureaucratic finesse. At 17, he was already a seasoned campaigner, having accompanied his father on expeditions to Normandy. In 1109, Henry arranged his betrothal to Mathilde d'Anjou, a marriage that would have bound the Norman crown to the rising power of Anjou a generation before Geoffrey Plantagenet entered the scene. The prince was everything a medieval heir should be: tall, handsome, skilled in arms, learned in letters. Contemporary chroniclers described him as his father's son in all things: intelligent, decisive, perhaps even ruthless when circumstances demanded. England's future appeared secure in his capable hands. November 25, 1120. The Norman court was returning to England after Henry's successful campaign in Normandy. The royal fleet lay at anchor in Barfleur Harbor, preparing for the familiar crossing to Portsmouth. Thomas Fitzstephen, whose father had captained William the Conqueror's flagship, begged the honor of carrying the prince back to England in his vessel, the White Ship. William agreed, perhaps influenced by the festive atmosphere among the young nobility. The White Ship's passenger list read like a who's who of Norman aristocracy: the prince himself, his half-brother Richard of Lincoln, his half-sister Matilda Fitzroy, and over 100 of the most promising young nobles in the kingdom. As evening fell, the crew and passengers celebrated their departure with wine. too much wine. The white ship cast off after the rest of the fleet, her captain boasting that his swift vessel would overtake the king's ships before reaching England. Instead, in the darkness of the Norman coast, the ship struck a submerged rock known as the Quillebeuf. The impact was catastrophic. In minutes, the finest ship in the Norman fleet was dragging itself under the black waters of the English Channel. William reached a rescue boat, but hearing the cries of his half-sister Matilda, he ordered his craft back toward the wreck. The overloaded boat capsized, taking the prince and his noble companions to the bottom. Only one man survived, a butcher from Rouen named Berthold, who clung to the mast until dawn brought rescue. Through him, the world learned how the Norman succession had died in a single night. The messenger who brought news of the disaster to Henry VIII at his palace in Rouen reportedly collapsed before he could speak the words. Henry himself, the chronicles record, never smiled again. With William's death, the carefully planned succession lay in ruins. Matilda remained, but a woman's claim to the throne was uncertain at best. The white ship had not merely claimed a prince. It had opened the door to civil war, to the 19 years of chaos that would follow Henry's own death in 1135. Yet in a strange way, William's death secured his father's broader legacy. Had he lived to rule, the crown might have passed smoothly from father to son, but England might never have known the Plantagenets. His death forced Matilda into her second marriage, to Geoffrey of Anjou, creating the union that would birth Henry II and the greatest royal dynasty medieval Europe ever knew. The prince who died at 17, who never ruled a day, had inadvertently shaped the future of England more profoundly than many kings who reigned for decades. Around 1090, in the first years of Henry I's adult life, a bastard was born who would prove more loyal, more capable, and more crucial to the Norman cause than many legitimate princes. Robert Fitzhenry, later Earl of Gloucester, emerged from obscurity to become the military backbone of his father's reign and his half-sister's desperate campaign for the throne. His mother's identity remains shadowy. Some chronicles suggest she was Sibylla Corbett, others point to an unnamed mistress of Henry's wild youth. What matters is not who bore him, but what Henry saw in him. A son whose illegitimate birth made him completely dependent on royal favor, and whose native ability made that dependence a treasure rather than a burden. Henry. I recognized Robert's talents early and invested in them heavily. By 1120, Robert had been created Earl of Gloucester, one of the richest and most strategically important earldoms in the kingdom. The honor came with vast estates in the West Country, control of Bristol, one of England's most important ports, and the responsibility of anchoring royal power in a region where Welsh raiders and Norman rebels posed constant threats. Robert's marriage to Mabel Fitzhamon brought him even greater wealth and influence. Mabel was heiress to extensive lands in Glamorgan and Gloucestershire, making Robert one of the richest magnates in the kingdom. More importantly, she was the daughter of a Norman family that had been vital to the conquest of Wales, giving Robert instant credibility with the Marcher lords. Under Henry I, Robert proved himself a capable administrator and military commander. He led expeditions into Wales, strengthened the defenses of the Welsh borders, and transformed Bristol into a center of Norman power that could rival London or Winchester in its wealth and strategic importance. When Henry there died in 1135 and Stephen seized the throne, Robert faced the defining choice of his life. Stephen was his half-brother, a man with whom he had grown up, fought alongside, shared the bonds of blood and brotherhood. Matilda was his half-sister, but also the rightful heir, the woman to whom he had sworn fealty at Windsor in 1127. Robert chose legitimacy over pragmatism, duty over blood. In 1138, he declared for Matilda, transforming himself overnight from one of Stephen's most important supporters into his most dangerous enemy. With Robert's defection, Matilda gained not just a brother, but a military genius, a treasury, and a base of operations that would sustain her cause for the next decade. From Bristol, Robert orchestrated Matilda's invasion of England. His ships carried her from Normandy to Arundel in 1139. His gold paid for her mercenaries. His strategic mind planned the campaigns that came tantalizingly close to placing her on the throne of England. The high point came at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, where Robert's tactical brilliance delivered Stephen into Matilda's hands. For a few brief months, it seemed as though the bastard son of Henry the Betrayer restored his sister to her rightful throne. Only the fickleness of London's citizens and the military prowess of Stephen's queen prevented complete victory. Through Mabel Fitzhamon, Robert sired a family that would carry Norman influence well into the next century. His eldest son, William Fitzrobert, inherited the earldom and proved almost as capable as his father. His daughter Mabel married the Earl of Devon, extending Robert's influence throughout the southwest. But Robert's most significant offspring may have been his illegitimate son, another William, who founded the powerful Fitzrobert family that held lands throughout the Welsh marches. Like his grandfather Henry III, Robert understood that bastards, properly managed, could be as valuable as legitimate heirs in the great game of medieval politics. Robert of Gloucester died in 1147, 2 years before Matilda abandoned her claim to the English throne. His death marked the beginning of the end for her cause. Without his military genius, his wealth, and his unwavering loyalty, the empress simply could not sustain her challenge to Stephen. Yet in a broader sense, Robert had already succeeded. By keeping Matilda's cause alive for nearly a decade, he had preserved the Plantagenet claim until her son Henry came of age. When Henry II ascended the throne in 1154, he did so not as a conqueror but as the heir of Henry I, the grandson whom Robert of Gloucester had fought 7 years to place on the throne. Contemporary chroniclers called Robert the finest general of his generation, a man whose loyalty was absolute and whose abilities were unmatched. He had been born a bastard, but he died having proven that in medieval politics, competence and loyalty could matter more than legitimacy. The bastard Earl of Gloucester had kept faith with his father's dynasty, and in doing so, had helped birth the greatest empire medieval Europe would know. Among the acknowledged bastards of Henry I, Richard of Lincoln remains one of the most enigmatic figures, a young man whose life was cut short before he could make his mark on history, yet whose death resonated through the decades that followed. Born sometime in the first decade of the 12th century, Richard was raised alongside his legitimate siblings at court, his bastard status no barrier to royal education and affection. The name of Lincoln suggests either that he was born in that ancient city or that Henry had intended to grant him lands there. Lincoln was one of England's most important towns, a center of trade and administration that would have made a worthy appanage for a royal bastard. Like his half-brothers, Richard was being groomed for service to the crown, his illegitimate birth transformed into a source of strength rather than shame. Contemporary chronicles suggest Richard possessed the quick wit and physical prowess that seemed to run in Henry's bloodline. He was trained in arms and letters, in the complex dance of courtly politics that would determine his future role in his father's empire. At court, he moved among the highest nobility of the realm, his royal blood opening doors that birth alone might have closed. Richard's fate became forever intertwined with that of his legitimate half-brother William when both young men chose to sail home from Normandy aboard the White Ship in November 1120. The decision may have been prompted by youthful camaraderie, the bastard and the heir sharing one last adventure, or perhaps by the simple desire to travel in the company of the most promising young nobles of the Norman court. As the White Ship cast off from Barfleur Harbor that November evening, Richard stood among the flower of Norman aristocracy. He was still young, his future bright with possibility. Henry V has shown that he rewarded loyal bastards handsomely. Robert of Gloucester's earldom was proof of that. Richard might have expected lands, titles, perhaps even an advantageous marriage that would establish his own dynasty. Instead, when the ship struck the rock in the darkness of the Channel, Richard joined his half-brother and over 100 companions in the freezing waters. The chronicler Orderic Vitalis, normally so detailed in his accounts of noble deaths, provides no specific record of Richard's final moments. He simply notes that among the drowned was Richard, the king's son, a brief epitaph for a life barely begun. Richard's death, overshadowed by the greater tragedy of William Adelin's drowning, nonetheless represented a significant loss to Henry I's carefully constructed network of loyalty and kinship. Every royal bastard was a potential anchor for Norman power, a future earl or regional magnate whose personal loyalty to the king could translate into decades of stability. With Richard's death, Henry lost not just another son, but another potential solution to the complex puzzle of medieval governance. The bastards were Henry's insurance policy against the uncertainties of legitimate succession. Their illegitimate status made them dependent on royal favor, but their royal blood made them natural leaders of the nobility. In the aftermath of the White Ship disaster, as Henry contemplated a future without his heir, the loss of Richard and his other bastard children aboard the ship must have seemed particularly cruel. They had been his instruments of policy, his regional strongman, his guarantee that Norman power would have multiple centers of support. Richard of Lincoln died young, leaving no mark on the chronicles beyond the simple fact of his drowning. Yet his death, coming alongside that of William Adelin, marked the beginning of the end for Henry I's grand design. The careful balance of legitimate and illegitimate children, of succession and support, of dynasty and loyalty, had been shattered in a single night. The young man who might have been an earl, who might have founded his own noble line, who might have served as a loyal pillar of his father's regime, became instead a footnote to one of medieval England's greatest disasters. His legacy lies not in what he accomplished, but in what his death made impossible. Born around 1110 to Sibylla Corbett, one of Henry I's most favored mistresses, Reginald emerged into a world where royal bastards could expect both privilege and purpose. Sibylla was no passing fancy. She bore Henry at least 4 children and maintained her position at court for years, her influence reflected in the advancement of her sons. Reginald's early life was shaped by his father's pragmatic approach to illegitimate offspring. Rather than hiding his bastards, Henry acknowledged them openly, using their royal blood as a tool of governance. Reginald was educated alongside his legitimate siblings, trained in the arts of war and administration that would make him useful to the crown. The surname de Dunstanville appears to derive from Henry's grant of lands to his son, though the exact location remains uncertain. What matters is that Henry provided for Reginald as he did for all his acknowledged bastards, with land, education, and the expectation of loyalty in return. Reginald's rise to prominence came in the chaos following Henry I's death. While his half-sister Matilda fought for the throne against Stephen, Reginald chose his side carefully. Unlike Robert of Gloucester, who declared for Matilda immediately, Reginald initially remained neutral, assessing which way the wind would blow. His calculations proved shrewd. When Matilda's cause began to gain momentum, Reginald declared for his half-sister, bringing with him the loyalty of the Southwest. His reward was substantial. Around 1140, Matilda created him Earl of Cornwall, one of the most economically important earldoms in the kingdom. Cornwall was no mere honorary title. The county contained some of the richest tin mines in Europe, providing both wealth and strategic importance. From his base at Launceston Castle, Reginald controlled the narrow peninsula that formed England's southwestern extremity, a position that made him virtually unassailable as long as he commanded local loyalty. As Sheriff of Devon, Reginald extended his influence throughout the southwest, becoming one of Matilda's most reliable supporters. When the Empress finally abandoned her claim in 1148, Reginald managed the transition to Henry II's rule with the same political skill that had served him throughout the Civil War. Reginald's marriage brought him further wealth and local connections. His children established themselves as permanent fixtures of the Cornish nobility, their descendants holding lands in the county for generations. Through careful marriages and alliances, Reginald wove his family into the fabric of southwestern England so thoroughly that they became indispensable to royal administration in the region. His success lay in understanding that for a royal bastard, regional power was often more secure than court influence. While other nobles rose and fell with the changing fortunes of royal favor, Reginald built a power base so solid that it survived changes of dynasty and the passage of centuries. Reginald de Dunstanville died in 1175, having outlived both the father who sired him and the half-sister whose cause he championed. His 40-year career as Earl of Cornwall represented one of the most successful transformations of royal bastardy into regional authority in medieval English history. He had taken the disadvantage of illegitimate birth and turned it into strength, using his royal blood to claim a position that no legitimate noble could challenge, then cementing that position through competent administration and political acumen. The earldom of Cornwall that he founded would remain one of the most important in the kingdom, traditionally reserved for royal princes. In the broader story of Henry I's children, Reginald represents the successful realization of his father's vision. He was living proof that Bastards, properly managed and strategically placed, could serve as pillars of royal authority. His loyalty during the anarchy helped preserve Matilda's cause until her son could claim his inheritance. The bastard who became Earl of Cornwall had vindicated Henry I's belief that blood, legitimate or not, could be transformed into lasting political power through intelligence, loyalty, and the patient accumulation of regional influence. Among the lesser-known bastards of Henry I, Robert Fitzedith represents the successful integration of royal blood into the regional nobility. Born in the 1090s, during Henry's early years as a landless Norman prince, Robert's very survival to adulthood marked him as fortunate. Many of Henry's illegitimate children died young, claimed by the diseases and dangers that stalked medieval childhood. His marriage to Maud d'Avranches was typical of Henry's strategic approach to his bastards' futures. Maud brought with her the lordship of Okehampton in Devon, a substantial estate that transformed Robert from royal bastard to regional magnate. The d'Avranches family had been prominent since the conquest, their loyalty to the Norman crown unquestioned, their lands strategically positioned to guard the approaches to Cornwall. Through this marriage, Robert gained not just wealth, but legitimacy, the kind of territorial authority that made royal bastardy irrelevant. He became Lord of Okehampton in his own right, his illegitimate birth overshadowed by his legal possession of one of Devon's most important fortresses. From Okehampton Castle, perched on the edge of Dartmoor, Robert governed his lands with the methodical efficiency that characterized all of Henry I's successful bastards. The castle controlled key routes through Devon, its position allowing Robert to monitor traffic between Cornwall and the rest of England. Robert's role during the anarchy remains unclear. Unlike his more prominent half-brothers Robert of Gloucester and Reginald de Dunstanville, he seems to have avoided taking sides in the civil war between Stephen and Matilda. This neutrality, if that's what it was, proved shrewd. By avoiding the conflicts that consumed so many of his contemporaries, Robert preserved his estates and his family's position. His administrative style appears to have followed his father's model, firm but fair, focused on maintaining order and extracting revenue without provoking rebellion. The records suggest he was an effective local ruler, the kind of magnate who formed the backbone of medieval governance at the county level. Robert Fitzedith died in 1172, having outlived most of his royal half-siblings. His longevity, over 80 years in an age when few reached 60, perhaps reflected the quieter life he had chosen. By avoiding the high politics that destroyed so many medieval nobles, he had preserved his family's position and founded a line that would endure for generations. His descendants remained prominent in Devon for centuries, their connection to the royal house gradually fading, but their local authority enduring. The Fitzedith family became part of the county gentry, their origins as bastards of Henry III remembered but no longer relevant to their day-to-day existence. Robert's career illustrates one of the most successful patterns for royal bastards in medieval England. The transformation of royal blood into territorial lordship, followed by the gradual integration into the established nobility. He had taken the accident of his birth and converted it into lasting advantage for his family line. In the broader context of Henry I's legacy, Robert Fitzedith represents the success of his father's policy toward bastards. By acknowledging his illegitimate children and providing for their advancement, Henry had created a network of loyal regional magnates whose personal interests aligned with royal authority. Robert's long life and successful career vindicated that approach. The bastard who became Lord of Okehampton had proven that in medieval politics, competence and loyalty could matter more than legitimacy, a lesson that would echo through the centuries of English history that followed. The union of Norman royalty with Welsh nobility produced one of Henry I's most culturally significant bastards in Henry Fitzroy, born between 1103 and 1105 to Nest Fyrch Rhys, the legendary Welsh princess known to chroniclers as the Helen of Wales. Nest was the daughter of Rhys ap Tewdwr, the last independent king of Deheubarth, making young Henry a bridge between two worlds, the conquering Normans and the ancient Welsh nobility. Nest herself was a figure of romance and tragedy, celebrated for her beauty and mourned for her fate as a political prize passed between Norman lords. Her relationship with Henry I, likely beginning during his campaigns in Wales, represented both personal attraction and political calculation. an alliance with the remnants of Welsh royalty that might ease Norman expansion into the turbulent Welsh principalities. Henry Fitzroy grew up conscious of his dual heritage, trained in Norman military techniques but aware of his Welsh royal blood. This combination would define his career, making him uniquely qualified to serve as an intermediary between the Norman administration and the Welsh nobility who still controlled much of their ancestral lands. As he reached maturity, Henry Fitzroy gravitated toward the Welsh marches, that violent frontier where Norman ambition met Welsh resistance in an endless cycle of raid and counter-raid. His royal blood, both Norman and Welsh, made him an ideal candidate for the dangerous work of border warfare, where understanding both cultures could mean the difference between success and disaster. The Marcher lordships were among the most challenging positions in the Norman realm. The lords who held them faced constant warfare, uncertain revenues, and the need to maintain delicate relationships with both their Norman overlords and their Welsh neighbors. Henry Fitzroy's mixed heritage gave him advantages that pure Norman nobles lacked. He could speak Welsh, understood Welsh customs, and carried bloodlines that commanded respect among the native nobility. His campaigns along the Welsh frontier were marked by the pragmatic brutality that characterized Marcher warfare. He led raids into Welsh territory, defended Norman settlements against Welsh attacks, and participated in the slow, grinding process by which Norman influence crept westward into Wales. Yet his Welsh heritage also allowed him to negotiate with Welsh princes, to arrange truces and alliances that pure Norman commanders might never have achieved. Henry Fitzroy's career ended as violently as it had been lived when he was slain in border warfare sometime between 1157 and 1158. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear. The Welsh frontier claimed many lives, and the chroniclers rarely recorded the details of Marcher conflicts. He may have died in a formal battle, in a raid, or in one of the countless small skirmishes that kept the borderlands in constant turmoil. His death marked the end of a unique experiment in cultural fusion. Few other Norman nobles could claim both royal Norman blood and royal Welsh heritage, and fewer still had used that combination to such effect in the brutal world of Marcher politics. With Henry Fitzroy's death, the Norman crown lost one of its most effective intermediaries with the Welsh nobility. Yet his brief career had demonstrated the value of Henry I's inclusive approach to his bastards. By acknowledging Henry Fitzroy and allowing him to embrace his Welsh heritage alongside his Norman training, Henry I created a tool of governance perfectly suited to the complexities of Welsh politics. The bastard son had served as a bridge between worlds, using his dual identity to advance Norman interests while respecting Welsh traditions. Henry Fitzroy's legacy lay not in lands or titles. The marches were too dangerous for such permanence, but in the demonstration that royal bastardy, properly managed, could transcend cultural boundaries. He had been both Norman prince and Welsh noble, serving his father's interests while honoring his mother's heritage. The bastard who died on the Welsh frontier had embodied the cosmopolitan nature of Henry I's empire, where Norman, English, Welsh, and Breton cultures mixed and merged in service to a crown that recognized talent regardless of ancestry or legitimacy. Born around 1092 in the early years of Henry I's reign, Fulk Fitzroy emerged from the obscurity that surrounded many of the king's lesser bastards. His mother's identity has vanished from the historical record, leaving only the simple fact of his royal paternity to mark his significance in the tangled genealogy of Henry's offspring. Unlike his more prominent half-brothers who carved out earldoms and founded dynasties, Fulk's path led not to temporal power but to spiritual authority. In an age when the church offered one of the few routes to advancement for younger sons and royal bastards, Fulk chose the monastic life, or perhaps had it chosen for him by a father who needed to provide for all his children within the limited resources of even a royal treasury. The name Fitzroy, literally son of the king, marked him as acknowledged royal bastard, but acknowledgement alone did not guarantee worldly success. For every Robert of Gloucester who gained an earldom, there were several illegitimate royal children who found their futures in religious houses, their royal blood serving the dynasty through prayer rather than politics. Fulk's monastic career unfolded at Abingdon Abbey, one of the most prestigious religious houses in England. Founded in the 7th century and refounded after the Norman conquest, Abingdon possessed extensive lands and considerable political influence. For a royal bastard seeking advancement within the church, it represented an ideal environment, close enough to court to benefit from royal patronage, wealthy enough to support scholarly pursuits, connected enough to offer opportunities for further advancement. As a monk at Abingdon, Fulk would have followed the Benedictine rule that governed most English monasteries, a life of prayer, study, and manual labor that offered both spiritual reward and social respect. The monastery's extensive library would have provided access to the theological and classical texts that formed the foundation of medieval education, while its role as a royal foundation ensured that talented monks could catch the attention of the crown. The records of Fulk's monastic career remain frustratingly sparse. Whether he rose to positions of authority within the abbey, whether he played any role in the abbey's relationship with his royal father, whether he contributed to the scholarly work that made Abingdon famous, all these questions remain unanswered. He appears in the Chronicles simply as another royal bastard who chose the religious life, his individual achievements overshadowed by his more worldly half-brothers. Fulk Fitzroy died in 1132, 5 years after his father and well before the Civil War that would test the loyalty of Henry's surviving children. His death marked the end of one of the quieter chapters in the story of Henry I's offspring, the bastard who chose contemplation over conquest, who sought salvation rather than sovereignty. Yet in the broader context of medieval royal bastards, Fulk's career was neither unusual nor unsuccessful. The church offered legitimate avenue for royal children who could not be provided with secular advancement, and monastic life carried considerable social prestige. A royal bastard who became a respected monk served his father's interests as effectively as one who became an earl. His prayers supported the dynasty's spiritual well-being. His presence at a royal foundation strengthened the crown's relationship with the church. Fulk's life also illustrated Henry I's comprehensive approach to his illegitimate children. The king who granted earldoms to Robert of Gloucester and Reginald of Dunstanville also ensured that his less militarily inclined bastards found appropriate places within the religious establishment. This pattern of placement demonstrated Henry's understanding that royal bastards, properly positioned, could serve the crown in multiple ways. The monk of Abingdon had chosen, or been chosen for, a path that emphasized service to God over service to king, yet in the medieval worldview the two were inseparable. Fulk Fitzroy's prayers for his father's soul were as valuable to the dynasty as his half-brother's swords. Among the most enigmatic figures in Henry I's extensive progeny stands Gilbert Fitzroy, a royal bastard whose very existence emerges from the shadows of medieval record-keeping only to disappear again, leaving historians to puzzle over fragments and possibilities. The chronicles that carefully recorded the careers of Robert of Gloucester and Reginald de Dunstanville mention Gilbert only in passing, if at all, suggesting either an early death or a life lived far from the centers of power that attracted chroniclers' attention. What little evidence exists suggests Gilbert was acknowledged as Henry's son, the Fitzroy designation marking him as a recognized royal bastard rather than a hidden embarrassment. Yet unlike his more prominent half-brothers, Gilbert left no clear mark on the political landscape of Norman England. No estates that bore his name, no descendants who could claim his lineage. The mystery surrounding Gilbert Fitzroy serves as a sobering reminder of the limitations of medieval record-keeping and the cruel selectivity of historical memory. For every Robert of Gloucester whose deeds filled chronicles and whose descendants preserved family history, there were perhaps several royal bastards who lived and died in relative obscurity, their royal blood insufficient to guarantee remembrance. Gilbert's shadowy presence in the historical record may reflect an early death. Infant mortality claimed many medieval children, and royal blood offered no protection against disease or accident. Alternatively, he may have lived a quiet life in some provincial manor, his royal parentage acknowledged, but his role in the great events of the age minimal. In the broader context of Henry I's legacy, figures like Gilbert Fitzroy remind us that royal fertility was not always translated into political advantage. The king who fathered over 20 children could not guarantee that all would survive to serve his interests, nor that all who survived would prove capable of significant achievement. The bastard whose life remains largely unknown had nonetheless played his part in the great gamble of medieval dynasty building. His very existence, however briefly recorded, testified to Henry I's prolific generation of potential heirs and allies. In an age when dynastic survival depended on numbers as much as talent, even the forgotten children served their purpose. Born around 1092, Sibylla of Normandy represented Henry I's first major success in using his illegitimate daughters to forge international alliances. Her marriage to Alexander III of Scotland in 1107 marked a crucial moment in Anglo-Scottish relations, transforming potential enmity into familial obligation and demonstrating Henry's sophisticated understanding of matrimonial diplomacy. The marriage was arranged when Sibylla was still in her teens, part of Henry's broader strategy to secure his northern border through kinship rather than conquest. Alexander I had recently ascended the Scottish throne, a young king ruling a kingdom that had been England's enemy as often as its ally. By offering his bastard daughter in marriage, Henry created bonds that would influence Scottish policy for a generation. Sibylla's royal blood made her an acceptable bride for a king, while her illegitimate status ensured that the marriage would not threaten the succession to either throne. It was a perfect diplomatic match, significant enough to honor the Scottish king, safe enough to avoid future complications. As Queen of Scotland, Sibylla embraced the religious patronage that was expected of medieval royal women. She founded and supported religious houses throughout Scotland, her donations helping to strengthen the Scottish Church and extend Norman religious practices northward. Her court became a center of cultural exchange, where Scottish nobles encountered Norman customs and Norman visitors experienced Scottish hospitality. Contemporary chronicles praise her piety and her charitable works, suggesting that she successfully adapted to her new role and won the affection of her adopted subjects. Her queenship represented a kind of soft power projection. Through her presence, Norman influence permeated the Scottish court without the need for military conquest or political coercion. Sibylla's religious foundations also served practical political purposes. By supporting monasteries and churches, she created networks of gratitude and obligation that strengthened royal authority throughout Scotland. Her patronage helped bind the Scottish Church more closely to continental religious practices, reducing one potential source of conflict between the kingdoms. Sibylla died in 1122 after 15 years as Queen of Scotland, leaving no children to inherit her mixed Norman-Scottish heritage. Her childless death was perhaps fortunate in dynastic terms. Offspring from her marriage might have complicated future Anglo-Scottish relations by creating competing claims to both thrones. Yet her legacy extended far beyond dynastic considerations. Through her 15-year queenship, Sibylla had helped normalize relations between England and Scotland, creating personal bonds between the royal families that would influence policy for decades. Her success as queen had also demonstrated the value of Henry I's policy toward his bastard daughters. They could serve as effective diplomatic tools while creating genuine political advantages. The marriage alliance she embodied survived her death, influencing Scottish policy during the critical years that followed Henry I's death in 1135. When England descended into civil war between Stephen and Matilda, Scotland's response was shaped partly by the bonds Sibylla had helped create between the royal houses. Her death in 1122 came just 2 years after the White Ship disaster, adding to the sense that Henry I's carefully constructed network of alliances and relationships was beginning to unravel. The bastard daughter who had become Queen of Scotland was among the last of Henry's children to die before the succession crisis that would consume England for nearly 2 decades. Sibylla of Normandy had proven that royal bastards, properly married and carefully positioned, could serve their father's interests as effectively as any legitimate prince. Her queenship had been both personally successful and politically valuable, a testament to Henry I's understanding that daughters, no less than sons, could be instruments of royal policy. Born to Ansfride, one of Henry I's mistresses, Juliane de Breteuil entered a world where royal bastards walked a narrow line between privilege and peril. Her early life at court would have been marked by the contradictions inherent in her position, acknowledged by the king as his daughter, yet forever marked by the circumstances of her birth, granted wealth and status, yet denied the ultimate security of legitimacy. Her marriage to Eustace de Breteuil seemed, at first, to represent the successful transformation of royal bastardy into noble alliance. Eustace was a powerful Norman lord, holder of strategic lands on both sides of the Channel, exactly the kind of magnate whose loyalty Henry I needed to maintain his cross-Channel empire. The marriage bound Eustace to the royal house through bonds of kinship, creating the personal obligation that medieval kings prized above written treaties. Yet the marriage also placed Julian in a position of terrible vulnerability. As the wife of a great lord, she shared in his political fortunes and his political disasters. When Eustace's relationship with Henry I soured, Julian found herself trapped between her loyalty to her husband and her duty to her father. The crisis came in 1119, when a bitter feud erupted between Henry I and Eustace de Breteuil over the custody of hostages. The dispute escalated rapidly, fueled by the wounded pride and violent tempers that characterized Norman aristocratic culture. Eustace, feeling himself wronged by the king, did what any Norman noble might do. He struck back directly and personally. His weapon was his wife. Using Julian as an agent, Eustace attempted to assassinate Henry I, turning the royal bastard against her own father in a plot that struck at the heart of medieval ideas about kinship and loyalty. The attempt failed. Henry I's suspicions or security apparatus prevented the assassination, but the betrayal was complete. Julian had been transformed from royal daughter into would-be regicide. The psychological impact on Henry I may have been even greater than the physical danger. Medieval kings expected treachery from ambitious nobles and foreign enemies, but to be betrayed by his own daughter, to have his paternal affection weaponized against him, must have shaken his confidence in the network of personal relationships that held his empire together. Henry's response was swift and merciless. Eustace de Breteuil was destroyed, his lands confiscated, his power broken. The king, who had shown such careful attention to his bastard's advancement, now demonstrated what happened when family loyalty was betrayed. After the failed assassination attempt, Julian disappeared from the political stage as dramatically as she had emerged. Some chronicles suggest she retreated to the Abbey of Fontevraud, that great refuge for noble women who had fallen from grace or found the world too dangerous for their continued presence. If she did indeed take the veil, it would have been both penance and protection. Penance for her role in the assassination attempt, protection from her father's continued anger and from the political consequences of her husband's fall. The convent walls that sheltered her would also have silenced her, removing her from the political equation that her very existence had complicated. Her final years remained shrouded in the same obscurity that concealed her early life. Whether she lived quietly in religious retreat, whether she ever reconciled with her father, whether she found peace after the violent upheaval of 1119, all these questions remain unanswered. Julian de Breteuil's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of Henry I's policy toward his bastards. While his illegitimate children could serve as valuable tools of alliance and administration, they could also become weapons in the hands of his enemies, their family loyalty compromised by marital obligation and personal ambition. Her attempted assassination of Henry I represented the dark side of medieval family politics, where personal relationships and political necessity intersected in ways that could prove deadly. The bastard daughter, who should have been an asset, had become a liability. Her royal blood transformed from advantage into danger. Yet perhaps her greatest legacy lay in what her betrayal taught Henry I about the limits of family loyalty. The king, who had invested so heavily in his relationships with his bastards, learned through Julian's treachery that even the closest family bonds could be corrupted by political pressure and personal grievance. The woman who tried to kill her father had demonstrated both the power and the peril inherent in Henry I's approach to his illegitimate children. They could extend his influence throughout the nobility, but they could also provide his enemies with intimate access to the royal person. Julian de Breteuil had been both instrument and weapon, and her story served as a warning about the double-edged nature of family politics in the medieval world. Among the daughters of Henry I, Matilda Fitzroy found her destiny in the windswept hills of Perche, that strategic county that straddled the Norman-French border. Her marriage to Rotrou III, Count of Perche-Hautefeuille, represented another successful deployment of royal bastardy in service of diplomatic alliance, binding one of Normandy's most important border lords to Henry's cause through bonds of kinship. Rotrou III was no minor provincial noble, but a significant power in his own right, controlling territories that dominated the approaches to Normandy from the south. His lands lay astride the routes that any French invasion of Normandy would have to take, making his loyalty crucial to Henry's security. The marriage to Matilda transformed a potentially unreliable ally into a family member, creating personal stakes in Norman survival. As Countess of Perche, Matilda presided over a court that blended Norman and French influences, her royal blood lending prestige to her husband's position, while her diplomatic skills helped maintain the delicate balance of border politics. The marriage appears to have been personally successful as well as politically advantageous. Chronicles suggest that Rotrou and Matilda developed genuine affection for each other, their union producing children who would carry both Norman royal blood and Percheron territorial claims into the next generation. Matilda's life ended tragically in the same disaster that claimed her half-brothers William Adelin and Richard of Lincoln. The white ship, carrying the flower of Norman nobility back from Henry's successful campaign in Normandy, bore Matilda among its doomed passengers when it struck the rock near Barfleur on that fatal November night in 1120. Her presence aboard the white ship reflected her status within Henry's family. She was important enough to travel with the prince and his companions, trusted enough to be included in the intimate circle of royal relatives and favored nobles who chose Thomas Fitzstephen's vessel for their return to England. Her royal blood had gained her entry to the most exclusive passenger list in Norman history. When the ship went down in the freezing waters of the Channel, Matilda joined over 100 companions in drowning. The chroniclers, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the disaster, provide few details about individual deaths, noting simply that among the drowned were many noble ladies alongside the prince and his male companions. Matilda's death represented more than personal tragedy. It marked the severance of a crucial diplomatic link that Henry had carefully constructed. With her drowning, the Count of Perche lost not just a wife, but his connection to the Norman royal house, potentially weakening his commitment to Henry's cause at a moment when the king needed all his allies. Yet Matilda's brief life had already fulfilled its political purpose. Her marriage had secured Rotrou III's loyalty during the critical years of Henry's consolidation of power, and her children preserved the bloodline that bound Perche to Normandy. Even in death, the alliance she embodied continued to influence border politics for years to come. Her daughters, surviving their mother's death, carried both Norman royal blood and Percheron territorial claims into marriages that would extend Henry I's influence into the next generation. Through these granddaughters, Matilda's legacy lived on, her royal heritage continuing to serve Norman interests decades after the White Ship disaster. The Countess of Perche, who died so young, had nonetheless proven the value of Henry I's diplomatic use of his bastard daughters. In an age when women's political power was largely exercised through marriage, Matilda had used her royal blood to cement an alliance that served Norman interests throughout her brief life and beyond her tragic death. Her story, overshadowed by the greater tragedy of Prince William's drowning, nonetheless illustrated the human cost of Henry II's grand strategy. The bastard daughter who became a countess had served her father's interests faithfully, only to die in the same disaster that destroyed his carefully planned succession. The marriage of another Matilda Fitzroy to Conan III of Brittany represented perhaps Henry I's most strategically brilliant use of his bastard daughters, creating an alliance that would influence Celtic politics for generations. Brittany, that stubborn peninsula jutting into the Atlantic, had always been a wild card in the politics of northwestern Europe. Breton, Celtic in culture, nominally French in overlordship, yet fiercely independent in practice. Conan III, known as the Fat, was a duke whose political acumen matched his physical appetites. His duchy controlled the southern approaches to Normandy, commanded important ports and trade routes, and maintained complex relationships with both the French crown and the Celtic kingdoms of Wales and Ireland. By marrying his bastard daughter to Conan, Henry I gained a crucial ally whose loyalty could help secure Norman dominance over the entire northwestern coast of France. The marriage transformed Matilda from royal bastard to sovereign duchess, her illegitimate birth forgotten in the grandeur of her new position. As Duchess of Brittany, she presided over a court that blended Norman administrative efficiency with Breton cultural traditions, her presence serving as a living symbol of the alliance between the two Celtic and Norman worlds. Through her marriage to Conan III, Matilda bore children who would carry both Norman royal blood and Breton ducal claims into the complex succession politics of the 12th century. Her daughter Bertha inherited the Breton ducal title, becoming one of the few women to rule a major duchy in her own right during the medieval period. Bertha's inheritance was secured partly through her mother's Norman connections. Henry I's support for his granddaughter's claim helped establish her as duchess against rival claimants. The Norman royal blood that flowed through Matilda's veins thus became a crucial factor in preserving Breton independence against French pressure. Through Bertha and her other children, Matilda's legacy extended well beyond her own lifetime. Her descendants would rule Brittany for generations, their dual Norman-Breton heritage allowing them to navigate the complex politics of medieval France while maintaining their duchy's fierce independence. Matilda Fitzroy's success as Duchess of Brittany demonstrated the far-reaching effects of Henry I's matrimonial diplomacy. Her marriage had not merely secured a temporary alliance, but had created lasting bonds between Normandy and Brittany that would influence politics for centuries. The Norman royal blood she carried into Brittany became part of the duchy's political DNA, strengthening its claims to independence while maintaining crucial ties to the Norman Angevin Empire. Her career also illustrated the remarkable opportunities available to royal bastards in the medieval world. Born illegitimate, she had risen to become one of the most powerful women in France, her duchy commanding resources and loyalty that many legitimate princes might envy. Her success validated Henry I's belief that bastards, properly positioned, could serve royal interests as effectively as legitimate children. The alliance she embodied between Normandy and Brittany would prove crucial during the succession crisis that followed Henry I's death. Breton support for Matilda the Empress during the anarchy owed much to the family connections that Matilda Fitzroy had established through her marriage to Conan III. Her life represented the successful transformation of royal bastardy into sovereign authority, the bastard daughter who became a duchess and founded a dynasty. In the complex web of alliances and relationships that held Henry I's empire together, Matilda Fitzroy had proven herself one of the most valuable threads, her marriage creating bonds that outlasted her father's reign and her own lifetime. The Duchess of Brittany, who began life as a royal bastard, had ended it as the founder of one of medieval Europe's most enduring dynasties, her Norman blood helping to preserve Breton independence for centuries to come. Among Henry I's bastard daughters, another Matilda found her calling not in marriage and dynasty building, but in the spiritual authority that religious life could offer to medieval women. As Abbess of Montevilliers, she wielded a different kind of power, spiritual rather than temporal, based on ecclesiastical authority rather than aristocratic marriage, yet no less real for being clothed in religious garb. Montevilliers was no minor provincial convent, but one of the most prestigious religious houses in Normandy, a foundation that traced its origins to the 7th century and boasted connections to the ducal house stretching back generations. For a royal bastard to be placed as its abbess represented both honor and opportunity, honor in recognition of her royal blood, opportunity to exercise genuine authority over extensive lands and numerous subordinates. The position would have come to Matilda through Henry I's careful management of church patronage, his ability to influence ecclesiastical appointments serving his broader political goals. By placing his bastard daughter as abbess, Henry ensured that one of Normandy's most important religious houses would be governed by someone whose personal loyalty to the crown was absolute. As abbess, Matilda presided over a complex institution that was simultaneously spiritual community, economic enterprise, and political entity. Montevilliers controlled extensive lands throughout Normandy, commanded significant revenues from its estates and urban properties, and wielded considerable influence over the spiritual life of the region. Her royal blood would have lent additional authority to her religious position, making her not just another abbess, but a member of the ruling family who had chosen spiritual over temporal power. This combination of royal birth and religious authority would have made her one of the most respected women in Normandy, her opinions carrying weight in both ecclesiastical and secular circles. The management of a major abbey required skills similar to those needed for secular lordship: financial acumen, administrative competence, the ability to navigate complex relationships with both superiors and subordinates. Matilda's success in the position demonstrated that royal bastards could excel in religious leadership as effectively as in temporal rule. Through her long tenure as abbess, Matilda Fitzroy demonstrated another successful path for Henry I's illegitimate children. While her sisters gained power through marriage to foreign nobles, she had achieved authority through religious vocation, her position at Montevilliers making her one of the most influential women in Normandy. Her career also illustrated Henry I's comprehensive approach to his bastard children. He found appropriate positions for all of them, whether in secular lordship, foreign marriage, or religious leadership. The king who granted earldoms to his bastard sons also ensured that his daughters, who were not needed for diplomatic marriages, could find honor and authority in the church. The abbess, who began life as a royal bastard, had ended it as one of the most powerful religious figures in Normandy, her authority deriving from spiritual rather than temporal sources, but no less real for that difference. Her success validated the medieval belief that royal blood, properly channeled, could serve divine purposes as effectively as earthly ones. In the broader context of Henry I's legacy, Matilda's religious career represented the successful integration of royal bastardy into the ecclesiastical power structure, her position at Montevilliers ensuring that Norman royal influence extended into the spiritual as well as the temporal sphere. Alice Fitzroy's marriage to Mathieu Refus of Montmorency represented one of Henry I's most far-reaching diplomatic successes, binding the Norman crown to one of the most powerful noble families in the Ile-de-France through bonds of kinship that would influence French politics for generations. The Montmorency family had been prominent since Carolingian times, their castle north of Paris commanding key routes into the French heartland, their loyalty crucial to any power seeking to influence Capetian politics. Mathieu I was no mere provincial lord, but a major figure at the court of Louis VI of France, his wealth and influence making him a valuable ally or dangerous enemy, depending on his allegiances. By offering his bastard daughter in marriage, Henry I gained not just Mathieu's loyalty, but access to the inner circles of French politics, intelligence about Capetian plans, and influence over one of the key noble families of northern France. The marriage elevated Alice from royal bastard to one of the premier noblewomen of France, her position at the Montmorency court giving her status that many legitimate princesses might envy. Her royal blood commanded respect among the French nobility, while her marriage created lasting bonds between the Norman and French aristocracies. Through her marriage to Mathieu I, Alice bore children who would carry Norman royal blood deep into the French nobility, their descendants rising to positions of influence that would shape French politics for centuries. The Montmorency line that descended from Alice would produce marshals of France, grand officers of the crown, and eventually dukes, whose power rivaled that of the royal house itself. Her children's Norman heritage, inherited through their mother's royal blood, would create complex loyalties during the conflicts between the Capetian and Plantagenet dynasties. Descendants of Alice Fitzroy would find themselves torn between their French allegiances and their ancestral connections to the Norman Angevin Empire, their divided loyalties reflecting the complex web of relationships that Henry I had created through his matrimonial diplomacy. The Montmorency family's later prominence owed much to the prestige that Alice's royal blood had brought to their lineage. Her marriage had transformed a powerful but provincial noble house into one with royal connections, their status enhanced by their kinship with the Norman crown. Alice Fitzroy died before 1141, likely before the Civil War that would test the loyalties of all Henry's surviving children. Her death spared her from having to choose between her English half-siblings and her French husband's allegiances, but her legacy lived on through her descendants' continued prominence in French politics. Her marriage had created one of the most enduring connections between the Norman royal house and the French nobility, the bonds she forged through her marriage to Mathieu I influencing diplomatic relationships for generations. Even as the Norman and French crowns became enemies, the personal connections created through Alice's marriage provided channels for communication and negotiation. The success of her descendants validated Henry I's investment in her marriage, proving that royal bastards, properly placed, could create lasting advantages for their birth families. The Montmorency line that traced its royal heritage to Alice Fitzroy would become one of the most powerful noble dynasties in France, their prominence a testament to the diplomatic value of Henry's illegitimate daughter. Her story illustrated the far-reaching effects of medieval matrimonial diplomacy, showing how a single marriage could create relationships that influenced politics across generations. The bastard daughter who became a French noblewoman had served her father's interests more effectively than many military campaigns, her marriage creating bonds that outlasted treaties and survived changes of dynasty. Alice Fitzroy had proven that royal blood, even illegitimate royal blood, could be transformed into lasting political advantage through careful marriage planning and diplomatic skill. Her legacy lived on not in her own achievements, but in the prominence of her descendants, the French noble line that carried Norman royal heritage into the heart of Capetian politics. On a November night in 1120, the carefully constructed edifice of Henry I's dynastic planning collapsed beneath the cold waters of the English Channel. The White Ship disaster had claimed not just the heir apparent, but 3 of his bastard children, leaving gaps in the network of loyalty and kinship that would prove impossible to fill. William Adelin's death opened the door to civil war, but the simultaneous drowning of Richard of Lincoln and Matilda Fitzroy, Countess of Perche, weakened the broader structure of alliances that held Henry's empire together. Each bastard had been placed with strategic purpose. Their deaths left vulnerable territories, severed diplomatic connections, and created power vacuums that Henry's enemies would exploit. The tragedy revealed the inherent fragility of medieval statecraft, where personal relationships formed the backbone of political authority. Henry there had built his system of governance around family loyalty, using his prolific generation of children as instruments of alliance and administration. The White Ship disaster proved that even the most carefully planned dynasty could be undone by a single night's misfortune. In the chaos that followed Henry III's death in 1135, the surviving bastards faced the defining choice of their lives. Stephen of Blois had seized the throne, but Matilda remained the rightful heir. Robert of Gloucester's decision to support his half-sister transformed the succession crisis into civil war, his military genius and territorial wealth providing the foundation for Matilda's 19-year campaign. Reginald de Dunstanville's control of Cornwall gave Matilda a secure base in the southwest, while her foreign relatives, the descendants of Henry's diplomatic marriages, provided external support. The bastards who had seemed like mere ornaments to Henry's court proved to be the pillars that sustained his daughter's claim through 2 decades of warfare. Yet their support also revealed the paradox at the heart of Henry's system. The bastards' loyalty to Matilda was absolute precisely because their illegitimate birth made them completely dependent on royal favor. They fought not just for their half-sister, but for the principle that blood, legitimate or not, created unbreakable bonds of obligation. The final irony of Henry II's reign lay in its demographic contradictions. The king, who fathered over 20 children, who seemed to guarantee his dynasty's survival through sheer fecundity, left England without a clear succession. His legitimate son died young, his legitimate daughter's claim was disputed, and the throne passed to a nephew whose reign would be marked by constant warfare. Yet Henry's bastards preserved his bloodline more effectively than his legitimate heirs preserved his crown. Through them, Norman royal blood flowed into the noble houses of England, Scotland, France, and Brittany. Their descendants would rule duchies, command armies, and influence politics for centuries after the Norman dynasty itself had passed into history. The bastards had become Henry's true legacy, not because they inherited his throne, but because they carried his genes, his ambitions, and his understanding of power into the future. Through careful placement and strategic marriage, Henry had embedded his bloodline so deeply in the European nobility that it became inextricable from the continent's political DNA. As the 12th century drew to a close, the fruits of Henry I's matrimonial diplomacy were still ripening. His bastard daughter's descendants governed provinces from Cornwall to Brittany, their Norman royal heritage lending legitimacy to their rule while their local connections ensured stability. The earls, counts, and dukes who traced their lineage to Henry's illegitimate children formed a network of kinship that transcended national boundaries. This web of relationships would prove crucial during the expansion of the Plantagenet Empire under Henry II. Former enemies became allies, uncertain provinces became loyal territories, and the complex politics of medieval Europe were simplified by the bonds of blood that Henry I's bastards had woven throughout the continental nobility. The Lion of Justice had achieved a form of immortality not through his legitimate successors, but through his illegitimate descendants. His bastards had taken his ambition and translated it into lasting power, his genes spreading through the aristocracy like seeds on fertile ground, growing into trees that would shade European politics for generations to come. In the end, the bastards of Henry I had proven their father's greatest insight, that in medieval politics, competence and loyalty mattered more than legitimacy, that royal blood, however diluted, retained its power to command respect and create opportunity. They had been born outside the law, but had made themselves indispensable to the kingdom, proving that in the great game of dynastic survival, every child, legitimate or not, could serve the crown's enduring interests. The king who had tried to secure his dynasty through legitimate succession had instead secured it through illegitimate expansion, his bastards preserving his bloodline long after his throne had passed to other hands. In their success lay both vindication of his methods and demonstration of medieval monarchy's essential truth that power, once properly distributed, could outlast the individuals who wielded it, flowing through generations like water through carefully constructed channels, finding its way to the sea of historical permanence through paths both expected and unexpected.